If only Ukraine had an atomic bomb, not just one, but many, then Russia definitely wouldn't have dared to attack us. And not just Russia, actually, no one at all would even dare to look at us the wrong way. You could hear this kind of reasoning in the media space even when our country wasn't directly threatened by anything. And starting from 2014, these thoughts took on a very concrete form and content, and that's not surprising at all. Russian hybrid and later open aggression made Ukrainian society and those in power bitterly regret the choice that was made in the early 1990s. In the turbulent early 1990s, Ukraine's leadership decided to disarm its nuclear weapons. A decision that today is considered one of the most controversial and ambiguous in all the years of independence. After all, the nuclear arsenal is still seen and regarded by many as the most important symbol of geopolitical power and even the only truly effective security guarantee. But at the same time, for some reason, many completely forget about the realities faced by the newly formed Ukrainian state, including a deep economic crisis, constant political instability, and the harsh pressure from global hegemons. So let's look into all the internal and external circumstances under which the Ukrainian elite at that time was forced to make that fateful decision. Let's analyze the positions of Western countries and Russia regarding the issue of nuclear weapons in Ukraine and other post-Soviet states. Let's also examine the notorious and much criticized Budapest Memorandum. And we'll try to model a situation in which Ukraine kept its nuclear potential and try to calculate the possible consequences of that decision. Get the most accurate, objective analysis here. I'm Seaman, and this is Megashow Television. Let's begin. How did nuclear weapons even end up in Ukraine? It's very simple. Ukraine inherited nuclear weapons from the dying Soviet Union. To be precise, Ukraine only got the weapons that were on its territory at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse. This wasn't done arbitrarily, but followed a specific legal procedure. On August 24, 1991, the Verkhovna Rada of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic adopted Ukraine's Declaration of Independence. And on this day, we celebrate the main national holiday, the Independence Day of Ukraine, and few people know that. On the same day, the Ukrainian parliament adopted another document of extraordinary importance. The resolution on military formations in Ukraine, which provided for the subordination of all military formations, units, and detachments stationed on the territory of the Republic to the Verkhovna Rada. From the text of this document, it followed that absolutely all military units and subdivisions of the Soviet army located on the territory of Ukraine were considered military, removed from Moscow's control, and subordinated to Kiev. No exceptions were made for those units that were equipped with nuclear weapons. Thus, the Ukrainian authorities acted quite reasonably, fairly, and civilly, based on the ancient legal principle, the principle of territoriality. What is on our land is ours. And what was on the territory of Ukraine at the moment of declaring independence? Oh yes, quite a lot. Since Moscow never gave up on the idea of Sovietizing all of Europe and exporting communism around the world, Ukraine, as the western edge of the Soviet Empire, was not just pumped with weapons, but rather was overstocked with weapons. There were so many munitions and military equipment that it allowed Ukraine to actively sell Soviet weapons to third world countries for the next 23 years. And they made good money from this export. It was only with the start of the Russian-Ukrainian War in 2014 that this practice was stopped. However, that's a completely different story. Let's return to nuclear weapons. As of August 24, 1991, there were about 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads and approximately 2,500 tactical nuclear charges on the territory of Ukraine, totaling around 4,300 nuclear warheads. This made Ukraine's nuclear arsenal the world's third largest, after the United States and Russia. The arsenal also included nuclear weapon delivery systems, 130 intercontinental ballistic missiles UR, 100N with 6 warheads each, 46 RT, 23 Molodets ICBMs with 10 warheads each, and about 44 strategic bombers Tu-95 and Tu-160 capable of carrying nuclear weapons. With such weapons, as they say, even the devil himself is no match. After all, it turned Ukraine into a powerful and prosperous state that all other countries in the world had to reckon with. Or maybe not America. America says no. The West's attitude toward Ukraine's nuclear arsenal, and even toward the very idea of independence for the Soviet republics as such, was ambiguous. First and foremost, everything directly depended on Uncle Sam's position. To put it bluntly, the United States was not initially interested in the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, in its weakening, or in the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan and Eastern European countries. Of course, the spread of market relations and the integration of the Soviet Union into the world market were undoubtedly in their interest. But the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics into 15 separate independent states did not at all correspond to Washington's interests. By the way, this completely disproves the claims of modern Kremlin propaganda, which from time to time pushes the narrative that the damned Western capitalists, together with the traitor Gorbachev, deliberately destroyed the Union of Indestructible Free Republics. In reality, everything was exactly the opposite. The United States, right up until the famous August coup, did everything to preserve the territorial integrity of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, both publicly and behind the scenes. But why did Washington take such a position then? First and foremost, of course, because of the nuclear factor, because of the threat of uncontrolled proliferation of weapons of mass destruction among other post-Soviet countries. It should be noted that as a result of the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, nuclear weapons ended up not only in Ukraine, but also in the possession of Belarus and Kazakhstan. Each had over 1,000 nuclear warheads. For the United States, 3 new nuclear states on the world map was a major problem. Washington saw this as a potential threat to global stability, especially in Eastern Europe, which had nuclear weapons and was on the path toward integration with Euro-Atlantic structures. Therefore, if nuclear weapons remained in Belarus, and especially in Ukraine, the United States would have had to deploy additional weapons along the borders with these countries, which would have required enormous financial investments. Therefore, starting at the end of 1991, the American authorities pursued the path of nuclear disarmament for the post-Soviet countries, especially Ukraine. At the same time, the nuclear status of the Russian Federation as the successor to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was never questioned by the international community, which in turn was an extremely unfair position, although what is there to be surprised about when has this policy, especially international policy, ever been fair? In short, the Americans began to put targeted pressure on Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan so that they would voluntarily give up their nuclear arsenals. To achieve this goal, both political diplomatic methods and purely economic incentives were used. Honestly, overseas strategists cared little about the interests of the young post-Soviet states. It should be noted that the European countries also shared the United States position, and above all, members of the so-called nuclear club, the United Kingdom and France. It was also extremely important for them that nuclear weapons remained in the post-Soviet space as before. In some countries, the West did not see Ukraine or other newly formed states as equal players on the international stage, but viewed them only as Russian satellites. Unfortunately, that was the reality of life. What were the Ukrainian authorities guided by? In order to understand why Ukraine eventually gave in to the pressure from Western countries, we first need to analyze the position of its political elite regarding nuclear weapons. As banal as it may sound, the situation was not so straightforward. The fact is that after declaring independence, the young Ukrainian state faced a huge number of problems, the possibility of which those in power had not even initially suspected. For example, Ukraine's first president, Leonid Kravchuk, and his team did not expect one of the richest Soviet republics to fall into its worst crisis in just months. A second global crisis, which not only brought the overwhelming majority of the people to the brink of mere survival, but also significantly undermined the country's position on the world stage. And indeed, who would take seriously a country with hyperinflation, catastrophic industrial decline, mass unemployment, and rampant crime? To this, we should also add Ukraine's dependence on energy supplies from Russia and constant political instability, which most often manifests itself in confrontation between the president and the Verkhovna Rada. The American side has successfully exploited all of these factors. weakening Ukraine and using them as effective levers of pressure on its opponent. As for the strategy of the Ukrainian political elite itself, there was no unified approach as such for a long time. On the one hand, the Declaration of State Sovereignty of Ukraine, adopted in 1990, remained in force, clearly stating that in the future, Ukraine would adhere to three non-nuclear principles: not to produce and not to acquire nuclear weapons. Soon after declaring independence, on October 24, 1991, the Verkhovna Rada issued an official statement on Ukraine's non-nuclear status. Political forces with a national democratic focus, like Narodny Ruch Ukraini, viewed nuclear weapons as key to national security and independence from Russia, which they already saw as a potential threat. American diplomacy played a huge role in making this decision. The Ukrainian authorities were made to understand unambiguously that if they kept nuclear weapons, the United States and its European allies would do everything to turn Ukraine into a pariah state, into a state like North Korea or Iran. And considering America's influence on the world stage at that time, such a policy could very well have succeeded. The young Ukrainian state, which had just risen to its feet, could easily have ended up in international isolation. There was another important issue that also pushed the Ukrainian authorities toward giving up nuclear weapons. Ukraine, if necessary, could not fully use its own arsenal. It simply did not have the technical capability. During the Soviet era, a system for controlling strategic nuclear weapons was implemented, which provided for carrying out only orders coming from the center, and as you understand, that center was in Moscow. The collapse of the Union did not change this situation. Thus, although nuclear weapons were located on the territory of Ukraine, in reality, the Ukrainian authorities did not have actual control over them. All the access and control codes were in the hands of the perpetually half-drunk Boris Yeltsin. Given these events, a logical question arose: why have such weapons? But yes, of course, Ukraine could have managed to reprogram the nuclear control systems to bring them under its own authority, but first, it would have taken a lot of time, and second, enormous financial resources, which simply weren't available during the economic catastrophe of the 1990s. And possessing nuclear weapons itself was not only an advantage, but also a major headache, since it required huge expenses to keep them in constant combat readiness. By the way, the Americans actively used this factor during further negotiations. They knew exactly which levers to press to get concessions. What about Moscow? Now let's examine the other side, the Russian Federation. It also had its own position regarding Ukraine possessing nuclear weapons, so in fact, there was pressure from both the West and the East. Ukraine literally found itself caught between a rock and a hard place. First of all, Yeltsin and his associates insisted that the Russian Federation was the only legitimate successor to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and therefore it, and only it, has the right to possess the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal, including the infrastructure and delivery systems. At numerous negotiation platforms, Russian diplomats repeatedly emphasized that the nuclear weapons located on the territory of Ukraine belonged to the Soviet Union and not to independent Ukraine. In addition, Russia used as a significant argument the already mentioned fact that the Ukrainian leadership did not have real technical control over the existing nuclear arsenal, since Moscow kept operational control, including launch codes and the control system. Even after the final collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the strategic forces remained under the control of the United Armed Forces of the Commonwealth of Independent States, headed by the Russian general Yevgeny Shaposhnikov. And for the United States specifically, I repeat, it was extremely important to maintain centralized control over the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal. So, it's no surprise the two former opponents fully agreed on this issue. Among other things, Moscow emphasized Ukraine's economic inability to maintain the nuclear arsenal. According to its estimates, the maintenance and modernization of nuclear weapons required significant financial expenses of up to $65 billion, which was unaffordable. Ukraine, in turn, proposed compensation for the transfer of nuclear weapons, including the cancellation of part of the debts for energy resources supplied to Ukraine. Let me remind you that up until 2014, Ukraine bought almost all of its gas, crude oil, and petroleum products from Russia. Of course, it should not be forgotten that, by insisting on the need for Ukraine's complete and unconditional nuclear disarmament, the Russian authorities had their own far-reaching goals. First and foremost, they significantly increased their influence over Ukraine, and in this context, the territorial claims to Crimea and Sevastopol should be viewed. In 1992-1993, Yeltsin effectively used the Crimea card to increase the already strong pressure on Ukraine so that it would finally and irrevocably give up its nuclear legacy. The Lisbon Protocol, the first step towards the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine and other post-Soviet states, was the signing of the so-called Lisbon Protocol in 1992. The fact is that just before the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on July 31, 1991, Gorbachev and Bush Sr. signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, better known by the abbreviation Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1. According to this document, the United States and the United States Soviet Republic were supposed to reduce their nuclear arsenals over the next 7 years. But since the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics soon simply ceased to exist as a separate subject of international politics, the legitimacy of this agreement was called into question. And since nuclear weapons also ended up on the territory of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, which did not retain any of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' obligations, it became necessary to re-sign the treaty, or rather, to improve it in accordance with the new realities. It was for this purpose that the aforementioned Lisbon Protocol was signed on May 23, 1992 de jure. It was an addition to Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1. Representatives from Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan also signed it, along with the United States and Russia. This document stipulated that Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine were obligated to eliminate their nuclear weapons as soon as possible and to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. In other words, the Lisbon Protocol was, in fact, the final renunciation of nuclear weapons by these states. At that time in Lisbon, it was also agreed that Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan committed to eliminating or transferring to Russia all nuclear warheads located on their territory. Since disposing of nuclear weapons was lengthy and costly, the second option was chosen, to give all nuclear weapons to Moscow. For the United States, this option was especially beneficial as it eliminated unnecessary expenses from the nuclear disarmament process, and Russia regained all the nuclear power of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics without any particular effort. And already in 1992 it regained all its tactical nuclear weapons. As for the strategic nuclear weapons, which actually caused the greatest concern in the West, Ukraine still tried to bargain here, with the aim of getting the maximum financial benefit for giving up weapons of mass destruction. The Ukrainian government valued compensation for its non-nuclear status at $2.8 billion at the exchange rate then. It also demanded security guarantees from all official nuclear-armed states: Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and China. And now we come to the well-known Budapest Memorandum. What's wrong with the Budapest Memorandum? It should be said here that Ukrainian diplomacy did everything possible and impossible for its time to negotiate the most favorable terms for giving up its nuclear arsenal. Counting on the fact that non-nuclear status would allow Ukraine to quickly integrate into the Euro-Atlantic civilized space, Kravchuk and his circle wanted to receive financial compensation from Western countries. Moreover, according to the Nunn-Lugar program adopted in the United States back in December 1991, significant financial assistance was provided for the safe elimination of nuclear weapons and infrastructure in post-Soviet countries. As confirmation of these diplomatic negotiations, at least the fact can be cited that the Lisbon Protocol was signed on May 23, 1992, but was ratified by the Verkhovna Rada. However, Ukraine's full accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons only took place on November 16, 1994. During this time, Ukrainian authorities held intense talks with both the United States and Russia, leveraging the threat of retaining nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip. Unfortunately, the worsening economic situation in Ukraine, as well as the deep political crisis that resulted in early parliamentary and presidential elections in 1994, significantly weakened their negotiating position. The United States and Russia actively took advantage of this. What exactly was Ukraine able to achieve during these months-long negotiations? First of all, Ukraine was able to secure funding from the United States for the dismantling of its nuclear military infrastructure in the amount of $500 million, which is almost 6 times less than what Ukraine had initially hoped for. Also, as compensation, a contract was signed for Russia to supply nuclear fuel to Ukraine's nuclear power plants, worth $160 million. Overall, it wasn't bad, but clearly insufficient for Ukraine's nuclear energy sector to function stably. In addition, Russia took on the responsibility of financing the transportation of nuclear warheads. But most importantly, Ukraine was finally promised the long-awaited security guarantees. But here's what those guarantees actually were. On December 5, 1994 in Budapest, Ukraine's new president Leonid Kuchma signed a memorandum on security guarantees linked to Ukraine joining the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. His counterparts were American President Bill Clinton, British Prime Minister John Major, and Boris Yeltsin, who had somewhat recovered after another drinking binge. Later, other members of the nuclear club, the leaders of France and China, also made statements about providing security guarantees to Ukraine. The Budapest Memorandum formally detailed the security guarantees Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States gave Ukraine for transferring its nuclear weapons. Specifically, not to threaten or use force against Ukraine's territorial integrity or political independence. And also, please note, to refrain from any economic coercion that could violate Ukraine's rights. Here, I ask you to at least remember the famous gas wars that arose between Ukraine and Russia back during the presidency of Viktor Yushchenko. And also, if situations arose concerning the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine, then the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia were supposed to hold joint consultations. And after that, there was only silence. The document itself is well written and nicely put together, but its practical content, to put it mildly, the Memorandum of Guarantees in reality did not provide any real guarantees, or to be more precise, it completely lacked any legally binding mechanisms to ensure the declared security guarantees. The Budapest Memorandum only assured Ukraine's security from the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia in return for giving up its nuclear weapons. However, it did not specify obligations or enforcement actions if Ukraine's sovereignty or territorial integrity was violated. This nuance made the Budapest Memorandum completely ineffective in the event of real aggression against Ukraine, especially if the aggressor was itself a signatory of the document. Of course, you might ask what real security guarantees should have looked like to protect Ukraine from aggression. The answer is simple, similar to the famous Article 5 of the NATO Charter. That is, the Budapest Memorandum should have included the well-known principle of collective defense, according to which an attack on Ukraine by any state would be considered an attack on the other signatory states. And thus, it would have obligated them to immediately come to the aid of the victim of aggression, including the use of their own armed forces. To our greatest regret, no country in the world was ready to provide such security guarantees to Ukraine, neither then nor today, and especially not today. We have already learned this harsh lesson well. Was everyone satisfied or not? Among those who hit the jackpot after the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, of course, are the Western countries, and first and foremost, the United States. Because without any significant costs, they achieved their strategic goal of reducing the number of nuclear powers. This, in turn, reduced potential threats to their national security, both in Europe and in the world as a whole. And for this potential threat, there was no need to allocate huge resources for the deployment and maintenance of new weapon systems, which would be so necessary in the event of a hypothetical conflict with Ukraine. It was this fact that allowed Washington to strengthen its diplomatic influence in Eastern and European regions, positioning itself as a guarantor that ensured peace and stability in this region. Here I want to emphasize that by nuclear disarmament of Ukraine, the West saved hundreds of billions of dollars. This should be remembered and reminded to some people when the conversation comes up about why we should supposedly give weapons to Ukraine for free. However, in the long term, the United States and the West as a whole rather lost than gained in 2014 against the backdrop of the cynical annexation of Crimea and the hybrid war in Donbass. It immediately became clear that Uncle Sam's reputation suffered significantly since the Americans were unable to stop Putin. Such a display of true powerlessness created a precedent, demonstrating that the assurances of great and powerful states can be empty if they are not backed by concrete commitments. Russia definitely won, since it gained a strategic advantage as the elimination of the nuclear arsenals of Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan effectively left them defenseless in the event of Russian aggression. This fact also allowed Moscow to maintain the status of the only nuclear power in the post-Soviet space, thereby significantly strengthening its regional dominance. Ukraine lost in any case because, having lost the most powerful deterrent factor, nuclear weapons, it became extremely vulnerable to external aggression from a neighboring nuclear power. The events of both 2014 and 2022 are undeniable proof of this. Security assurances from the United States and the United Kingdom were not accompanied by concrete mechanisms for their implementation or clear legal obligations. As a result, Ukraine has lost not only 20% of its territory, but also tens of thousands of its innocent citizens, and continues to exhausted and heartbroken from this since September due to Russia. Let's suppose that President Kravchuk or his successor Kuchma decides to keep nuclear weapons and their delivery systems motivated by the need to protect against potential Russian aggression. What would have awaited Ukraine then? First of all, the United States and European countries, and possibly others as well, would definitely have imposed sanctions on Ukraine, at least at the level of those against North Korea, Venezuela, or Iran. The road to the West would have been closed for Ukraine. Membership in the European Union and NATO would have been as much of a dream as flying to the Alpha Centauri system. And moreover, most likely, a new Iron Curtain would have arisen between Ukraine and other European countries, which would have hindered not only cultural and civilizational exchange, but also the establishment of normal economic cooperation. And most importantly, it would have made access to Western technologies impossible, which would have been absolutely necessary for Ukraine's extremely complex nuclear arsenal. Conversely, Russia would inevitably have intensified its pressure on Ukraine. Moscow might have stopped supplying gas and oil and begun organizing and supporting pro-Russian separatists in Crimea and southeastern Ukraine. A kind of Russian Spring, just in a different way, and the war in Gabalid most likely would have broken out much earlier than 2014. In turn, the already deep and prolonged economic crisis in Ukraine would have worsened due to unbearably high costs, which would inevitably have led to social protests and political instability. In that case, the Ukrainian army and special services would have become key players in the political arena. This would very likely have led to further militarization of the state, the weakening of democratic institutions, and the establishment of a military dictatorship similar to those in Latin America. And in that case, Ukraine would have become a real banana republic, but with a Satan bomb. Tell me honestly, would you want to live in a country like that? So, let's draw some conclusions in the context of the international situation that developed after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in the early 1990s. Ukraine lacked the resources to maintain the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, regardless of perspective. No matter what various so-called experts say, it's clear to any reasonably thinking person that without the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics or strong allies, a pariah state, which Ukraine would have become, would be doomed to poverty, backwardness, and a lack of prospects. Even modern Putin's Russia would hardly be able to achieve anything without the tacit support of China and other countries of the global south. And if Ukraine had kept nuclear weapons, it wouldn't have found reliable allies either in the West or in the East. Ukraine should have pushed for stronger, more effective security guarantees in case its territorial integrity was violated. And above all, membership in NATO or bilateral military agreements with clear commitments. As a last resort, preferential access to modern defensive technologies possessed by the United States and Western allies. Neither the first nor the second nor the third worked out or was even planned. Ukraine's unsuccessful experience once again highlights that international agreements must always be backed not by empty promises, but by real mechanisms for fulfilling the guarantees undertaken. Without them, voluntary renunciation of nuclear weapons can turn out to be an unjustified risk, especially if your neighbor is obsessed with imperial ideas of restoring former greatness and has a pathological drive to seize and subjugate everything. That's all from me. Thank you for watching, and thanks to all the sponsors for financially supporting the channel. Goodbye, everyone.